David, a man after God's own heart. David is one of the most fascinating characters in all the Bible, it seems to me. I mean, what Don did last night, walking us through to see how Moses learned humility, I'd never seen that picture before. I'd never seen Psalm 112 like Terry did. But Terry laid a good definition out yesterday when he talked about being a man is one who accepts and fulfills his responsibility. If that's the case, then sometimes David was and sometimes David wasn't. In fact, what I would tell you as we get started here is maybe not the sin that David committed with Bathsheba that is our foible, that has been our flaw, but David is us. He is us in so many ways. More than perhaps we would like to acknowledge. He's a man we love. He's a hero. He's a man referred to in the New Testament more than any other Bible character. According to Charles Swindoll, 59 times, 66 chapters are devoted to him, more than any other Bible character. All that's according to statistics by Charles Swindoll. I didn't check that because I'm not a stat guy. I just read what somebody else said, so you take that for what it's worth. I don't have a website I forgot to give you. That means he is a prominent person in all the Bible, more than Abraham, more than Joseph, more than Elijah. All of those men would have been men that perhaps this could have been said of. And with the exception of Elijah, who God took with him, and we have no real record except for his moment of weakness when Jezebel threatens his life. There's no moral issue with him. He just has a moment of weakness. Abraham lied, and he was just a dodo bird. Sarah said, I can't do it. There's Hagar. He had another option. No. Instead, he did. It cost him, and it's cost the world. Jacob. He's a deceiver. He's a liar. He's a polygamist. And cheats his father, lies to his father, and takes from his brother. That's the kind of brother man you want to be, right? Then you have Joseph. Well, there's no moral indication of anything that Joseph did that was wrong. And there's some debate as to whether he was the brat or not. I'm not persuaded that he was. He was faithful to his responsibility. He's the one that helps fulfill Genesis 15, 13 through 14, the promise that God made to Abraham. Elijah, with that one moment of weakness, is a man that we all admire. But we come to David, a singer, a poet, a warrior, a loyal friend, a king, haunted, hunted. He's a man, when we first hear the statement, a man after God's own heart, we say, that's the man I want to be. Except when that statement is first given in 1 Samuel 13. David is not even born. I'd never seen that before. The statement in 1 Samuel 13 follows the incident in which Saul has been appointed as king, anointed as king. And I'm not good with timelines, so maybe my timeline is off, and I'll give you that. But it seems like, from what happens in the narrative, that in the second year of Saul, he gets ahead of himself. And he offers the sacrifice before Samuel gets there, and it blows a hole in his whole effort to be a king. And right after that, Saul is rejected, and God says, I have raised up a man after my own heart. Well, if it's in the second year of Saul's reign, Saul reigns for 30 years before David's ever born. So that statement's made, if that's true, again, my timeline may be off, and I give that. But if that's true, David's not even born yet. In fact, we would not know it applied to David had not Luke included that in Acts chapter 13. And Luke chapter 13, verse 22, in the sermon that is given there, it is applied to David, a man after God's own heart. And so when we look at that, there are some things that we need to struggle with that, and I'll get to that in just a moment. The other thing we need to set as a background here is the time in which all this takes place. You know, we're all byproducts of our time, our circumstances. I mean, you go back to the Alamo. You have Crockett, Travis, and Bowie. I'm not sure those men would have been the same men they are in a different circumstance. You take George Washington, the father of our nation. There's no other man at that time that could have performed the task that Washington performed. Adams could have done it, Jefferson could have done it, Madison could have done it, Monroe couldn't have done it. Nobody else, Hancock could have done it. Nobody could have done what Washington did and keep the nation together. Eisenhower. Nobody else could have done what Eisenhower did dealing with MacArthur, dealing with Truman, and dealing with Montgomery, with Churchill, with Roosevelt. Nobody could have done what Eisenhower did. They were men of their times. And when we look at the time that David lives in, it helps set the scene on something, I think, that helps us understand the statement a little bit more. Things are on a decline. Eli's getting older. He's got two sons that are as sorry as the day is long. They take advantage of people. They cheat people. They're the exact opposite of what being a man is. They are abusers. They're bullies. They're rapists. They violate the temple of God and therefore spit in God's face. Eli does nothing about it. He didn't restrain them. Samuel is born as a gift to Hannah, and he's raised in the house of Eli and sees all that takes place in the house of Eli, but great as Samuel is, as he ages, he's got two boys, and they're just about as sorry as Hophni and Phinehas. A legacy that Terry talked about last night from Psalm 112. How about a legacy? Maybe Samuel's problem was he was gone from home too much. Guys, we who preach, when I first started doing this back in 79, first of all, I never intended to do it. I loved preaching at that time because I grew up in it and didn't want anything to do with it. But my dad sat down with me and Jody, and one thing he said was, "I'm telling you," and he was very specific and firm about it. "Don't you ever get so busy with brethren that you forget your family." And after I moved here, things, to say the least, were very hectic. And Cody had a wrestling match that I missed, and my dad found out about it, and he scolded me in front of the rest of the family and said, "I told you not to do that." Fellas, if we preach, if we're elders, we're deacons, just Christians all in general, and we get too busy with other things that we miss the time with our family. Or fellas, if we preach and we save the world and lose our family, we've lost it all. Noah's the most successful preacher in the Bible. Well, he lost the world. He saved himself and his family. And so if we get too busy like Samuel's going here, there, and everywhere. He doesn't spend time at home. And he doesn't attend to his responsibilities, and as a result of that, his boys can't take his place. So you got Eli that's failed, Hophni and Phinehas have failed, Samuel's failed, and his two sons have failed. And then you have all the nations around them that have a king. We want to be like somebody else. I want to be like Terry. I want to be like Breck. I want to be like Jordan. We want to be like somebody else. And so they cried for a king. God said, I'm going to give you a king. Back off. Pull back on the bit a little bit here. No. We want a king, and here's the deal. We want a king that we want as a king, not the king you want as a king. And God said, okay, you better be careful what you ask for, because you might get it. And so the nation is failing. The leaders are failing. The nation cries out for a king. And it's a king they want to choose, and a king like they want, not like what God wants. And God says, okay, there's this guy over here in the corner hiding. By the way, this is an interesting dynamic to me. He's head and shoulders above everybody, but he's in the corner hiding, nobody sees him. Now, if he's barely 5'8" hiding in the corner, I get that. But if he's Rick Foster's size, 6'4", taller than everybody else, hiding in the corner, that's a little fascinating. Here's the guy, they're saying we want a king, and he's head and shoulders above everybody, and he's hiding in a corner. That's really the guy you want, right? And God says, there he is. You take him. And Saul is set up to be king. And Don's lesson last night on Moses was significant because it talked about the development of humility. But in 1 Samuel 15, it is said, when Samuel confronts Saul, he says, when you were little in your own eyes. That's my definition of humility, Don. Little in your own eyes. He was little in his own eyes. But when Saul began to be impressed with his own size and his own position, he then put himself ahead of God. In fact, he made a monument to himself. We think Nebuchadnezzar did that. He made a monument to himself. This is a humble guy. Now, it's one thing if the Dallas Cowboys make a bronze image of Tom Landry and set it outside of AT&T Stadium, but it's another thing if Tom Landry makes the bronze stadium and sets it out there. And so, impatient, ill-advised, right out of the box, he goes to Gilgal, offers a sacrifice, and boom, God said, I've rejected you. And I'm going to raise up a man after my own heart. Well, now you got to have that man. But the man that's chosen is not a man. God tells Samuel, you need to go to the house of Jesse. And you need to go there to find the next king. And so he goes to the house of Jesse to find the next king. In walks Eliab. Tall. In walks Abinadab. Tall. In walks Shemaiah. Tall. Sorry, it's not them. You got any more kids? Got any more sons? These three and the next three aren't it. You got another one? He said, yeah. We got a runt. He's the runt of the litter. He's out in the South 40 watching the sheep, killing bears and lions with the bare hands. These guys aren't. They look kingly, but hey, they're here acting kingly. This guy's out killing bears and lions with the bears. He's just the runt. And he says, well, go fetch him. I like runts. Zacchaeus, my favorite Bible characters. I like those wee little men. These tall guys I don't get. And so, they fetch him. If you'd have been the next door neighbor to Jesse, and you've seen David coming, you'd think, well, he must have got thirsty, or he's hungry, he's coming in for a meal, or a drink of water, or maybe he's got to use the bathroom. Although out with the sheep, I'm not sure that would have been a problem. At least for men. And so he walks in, and boom, he's the one. He's anointed as king there. If he's around 15 years old at this time, there's going to be another 15 years before he actually takes the throne. Because he doesn't start ruling until he's about 30. Which, by the way, is an interesting number of men that begin to rule and do significant things. Jesus' ministry, public ministry, started at age 30. It's amazing how many things start at age 30. I think I started way too young. I was age 24. And so he's got to wait. Well, initially, Saul says, Okay. And by the way, can you play music? I can play real good. You want the guitar, you want the piano, you want the fiddle, it doesn't matter. I can play. Whatever you want to play, I got it. And when you have an anxious moment, hey, I can soothe you. Sometimes I'll go into Jordan's office, he's in there studying, and he's got this soft classical music in the background. Soothed, studying, until I walk in, and he says, Alexa, hush. And he gets violent again. And so David, and David lives with him. That's chapter 16. In chapter 17, the man who should be a king, the man who should have been a man, stood head and shoulders above everybody, with the three older brothers, at least three older brothers of David are out there, and you got them sitting on one hill, and the Philistines on another hill, and a valley in between, and you got this giant that comes down in the valley 2 times a day for 40 days. He's walking back and forth and saying, nanny, nanny, boo-boo, nanny, nanny, boo-boo. My God's better than your God. And they stand up there and say, oh no, what can we do? We can't beat him. In comes the runt. His daddy sends him to see how the battle's going, also to take some refreshments. And the only thing can be said by his older brothers is, we know you're a brat. Just simply to come to spy out, to see what's going on, because you can fight and do nothing here. And David sees that and he says, whoa, time out here. He hears this. In chapter 17, it never says he saw it, it says he hears it. And then he says, who's this guy that he's defying the living God? And then he said, he's a dead man walking. He goes down, he picks up the smooth stones. He's really good with a slingshot, and he flings that stone and thud, hits him in the head and fells him, runs down, takes his spear, which caused great strength on his part to lift it up, and then chops the guy's head off. And now King Saul and the rest of them are encouraged. Now they're men. Now they'll chase them, because now the Philistines are on the run. And they fight some more battles. And then the psalm begins to be sung. Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. You'd like for the story of David to stop with the killing of the giant. And you could say, that's a man after God's own heart. Because he took the battle to the enemy. And he did not let the enemy win. When the psalm began to be sung, that doesn't sit well with Saul. And Saul is enraged. And multiple times while David's playing the music, he's not soothed. He picks up the spear and tries to pin him to the wall with it. David spends the next period of his life on the run. Most of the time when we think about David, there are 2 events in the life of David that we think about. One is this: a moment of great victory, a moment of great triumph. We think about Saul chasing him and everything. But eventually Saul dies. Jonathan befriends David. It ticks Saul off to no end. And Jonathan protects David. And eventually Saul dies because he takes his life. Pause just a moment. Tim did some work on this years ago, and I asked him to share his material with me. And so these numbers are things that Tim has researched. He does an excellent job on that stuff. So David's a young man who's been anointed as king. Saul is at his prime, but he's failed. And now he becomes jealous of David. He probably at this time is in his 60s or 70s. Saul is. And David's young. Jonathan is probably, he's already a man of war. He's been out to battle, leading battle. Jonathan probably is about age 45. And David's young. It's kind of like a Paul Timothy sort of thing. I thought for years that this thing of Jonathan and David was they were just kind of kissing cousins. I have a cousin that preaches, George Slover, and we're about a year apart. But instead it was more of a mentor situation with David and Jonathan. And Jonathan took David and befriended him and was loyal to him, and David was loyal to Jonathan. But Saul was envious. And here's my sidebar that has nothing to do with David, but it has everything to do with us, where many of us are at. We have a number of young men who are great Christians, who are talented, who are so very talented. I've known Tyler since he was born. Grew up here, went off to A&M, has come back, is establishing himself along with Shelby here in this church. Significant to see a young man like that come. Tyler has such great potential for the Lord. Ryan, I've known since he was 9 years old. And Ryan went through the training program here with me. Has such great potential. And we have a lot of young men who are preaching the gospel that are really talented. Noah has just been with me a little over a year. But in the year plus he's been with me, his development has been tremendous. I'm very proud of him. I'm looking forward to what he will become in the next several years. Jordan, my estimation, there's just nobody else in his class, in his age group. These young men are talented. And they're going to be used. Now I'm 66. And I hear Noah preach. I hear Jordan preach. I hear Ryan preach. And I walk out in the foyer and I hear it. I hear the brethren slobbering all over them. Telling them how sweet they are, how great they are. I've never heard anything like that before. I'm standing back saying, did I just become Fruit Loops? And I begin to think, whoa, wait a minute here. What's happening here? All of a sudden, I'm not the lone guy here. I'm sharing something with somebody else. Somebody else is. And now they're getting the attention. And by the way, they're good. They're good. And I can't do what they do. I can't do what Jordan does. I look at that and I think, so what about me? What's happening to me? I remember something Paul Earnhardt told me years and years ago. Paul's 90 now, so Paul was probably in his early 60s when he told me this. He said, I must decrease so you can increase. I thought, do what? And I thought, what a model. And so guys, as we get older, and these young men develop, these young men begin to mature, and these young men to become somewhat, because of their talent, they become elders in our churches. It's not time for us to sit back and say, oh, I can't do that. It's time for us to say, look at our legacy. Look at our legacy. Because as they do well, I do well. And so if there's someone you have influence over, and all of a sudden they get more attention than you do, that's a compliment to you. That's not saying someone's left you out. But that's not how Saul took it. Saul took it as a threat. These young men are not threats. They're compliments. And they are legacy. And I think about that legacy a lot from different points of view. And I appreciated Terry's point about that last night. Someone handed it off to me. At one time, I was a legacy. I hope I still have several years left. My dad's 94, still going well, so I hope I still have some years left. That I don't have one foot in the grave, another banana peel yet. But I also realize I'm 66. I got 34. I got 25. I got 34, 35 back here. I got 29 over here. I got 26 over here. okay, we cheer them on. We hold them up because they are our legacy. That's important. Saul missed that. Saul missed it. So he's in pursuit of David. David's fleeing. David has two chances to take his life. And I love the statement of David. I love this. I will not touch God's anointed. Now I know David is anointed king, so it's not an exact parallel, okay? I know it's not an exact parallel. But we begin to take and knock off the giants among us because we find out they have flaws. We're not like David. When we say, okay, I look at this man of a generation past and I see how he behaved, and I begin to attack him because of how he behaved. It's not that they're God's anointed, but what we're doing is we're knocking down someone God has used to do something great that enables us to have a legacy today. Maybe as preachers we haven't been perfect, and maybe as elders we haven't been perfect. Maybe as Christians we just haven't been perfect. We take people who have some kind of experience with God, and we find their flaw, and we begin to tear them down because of their flaw. We're not doing what David did. David had such respect for Saul that even when this guy came and told David, I took his life, which was a lie, David said, you should have told me the guy fell on his sword. Instead, you came and you had to brag about yourself and you had to say, I took his life. Bad news. You're gone. You don't touch God's anointed. David had such respect for Saul. In spite of what Saul did, he had such respect for him. He would not touch him himself and would not tolerate anybody else touching Saul. Now pause there. You talk about someone owning responsibility. How many of us would have done what David did if someone had been insulting us like that? I've been insulted. I'm not asking for a Purple Heart here. But I have not done what David did. I've got off insult. I've held up a banner and said, woe is me, will you please cry with me? Will you please weep with me? Will you please tell me how really good I am when I'm not? That's not what David did. David continued to honor who Saul was at that time, even though God had taken the kingdom away from him. We come to 2 Samuel, and David's life really begins to take off. Now that Saul's dead, he's the king. Several battles take place. He's a man of war, and as a man of war, he spares nobody. I mean, in 1 Samuel 15, Saul was told, you go and you slay everybody, and he kind of saves who he wants to. But David, when he goes into battle, listen, if you're the enemy, you're slaughtered. You're gone. That's why he couldn't build the temple, because he's a man of blood. He's a man of war. He is a valiant warrior. As a warrior, he's the man you want leading your army, because he's going to give the victory. The enemy is going to be graveyard dead. They're not going to win. Not against David. He's going out to battle. He's winning everything, but now he just decides to stay home one day. Sends the men out to battle. Joab, you take them out. Here's his cousin. You take them out. He takes them out. And Saul stays home, and so he wants to stretch. Boring moment. Goes out on top of his roof. And off in the distance, he sees a woman bathing. Now, most of the time, when you bathe, you take your clothes off. And sure enough, she had no clothes on. And she was close enough to his vision. I don't get the binoculars here. He can see she is a good-looking woman. And David's not the only man to be seduced by a good-looking woman. I doubt I would have a hand raised if I asked, did you marry a woman that looked like an old goat? Every one of us think our wives are the most beautiful woman we ever saw. Now, it's okay to appreciate the aesthetic beauty of someone. We butchered Matthew 5:28. We said, don't you look? Because if you look, you lust. No. There's an aesthetic side that God created that we are to appreciate. But David desired to possess that which he had no right to possess. That's the point. It's not that he looked and saw. He could have turned and walked away. There's a choice here. But he looked, he saw, and he pursued to possess that which he had no right to possess. Here's another interesting sidebar. Do you know who Bathsheba's grandfather is? Ahithophel. Do you know the place that Ahithophel played in the house of David? Chief counselor. To inquire of Ahithophel was to inquire of God. Although Ahithophel is really a snake. Because in a little while he's going to turn on him and he's going to turn to Absalom. This is Ahithophel's granddaughter from the book of Rickie. It would seem to me like that if Elam's her father, the son of Ahithophel, he's one of David's mighty men, that Ahithophel is there, granddads keep granddaughters. Granddads keep grandkids. And so if Ahithophel's in the court of David, guess who's going to be running around playing in the court of David? While she's growing up? Bathsheba. This is a girl who's become a woman he saw as a little girl growing up. And now, he knows her grandfather. Her father's out fighting with her husband. And he calls for her. And the sin is committed. Again, we'd love for the story to stop at the killing of the giant. Because from that moment forward, David's life is one calamity after the other. If we could have stopped with the giant, the legacy would have been great. But now the legacy is going to be spotted. There's only one person in the life of David that didn't have a choice with regard to what they did. And that's that little baby. That little baby boy never had a choice. The son was taken from him. Amnon had a choice. Absalom had a choice. David had a choice in the census. David had choices all the way along. He had a choice on the showbread. He didn't have a right to the showbread. He said, the king sent me on a mission. No, the king, you're running for the king. The king didn't send you on a mission. You're running. Got any food? Oh, I got the showbread. Okay, take it. But then the priest is slain too because he gave David the showbread. Now he's giving refuge to the enemy as far as Saul's concerned. So he pays the price. You got the showbread. You got the census. You have the insurrection of Absalom. And it's interesting when Absalom comes, he comes before the king. It doesn't ever say he came before his daddy. He came before the king. And when David has to leave town because Absalom's so pursuing him so much, before he comes back, he has to ask the elders of the city, can he come back? But he's still the king. He's lost control. He's lost it all. And the Lord said, your house is going to be one total wreck from now on. And it was. How does that narrative fit the statement Luke applies to David as a man after God's own heart? So I appreciate David Banning being in a meeting because I had to study this a little bit more. I'd never looked at it before, really. I just taken it at face value. And you can disagree with me, that's fine. No need to write a card about it. I'm telling you what I know. You can disagree about it, that's fine. Maybe we've put the emphasis on the wrong person here. Maybe the emphasis is we've put the emphasis on David as opposed to the statement itself and looking back at it. Keep in mind, the narrative is we want a king, we want a king, we want a king. We want to choose the king. We want a king like we want a king. And God said, I'm going to give you a king. He said, but I was already had a king in mind for you. But now you've rejected me. I'm going to let you choose the king you want to have. 1 Samuel chapter 12, about verse 21. You can choose the king. This will be a king of your choosing, not my choosing, because the king I was going to choose, I promised to you, hadn't been born yet. And that was going to be a king of my choosing and of my appointment. But now then you're asking for a king of your choice. And so instead of the statement reading, a man after God's own heart, which seemed to then put the modification on David the man, if we put the modification on God, this is a king now of God's choosing. David will now be a king of God's choosing, not a man of your choosing. Here's a man I'm going to choose to be king that is going to be according to my choice, not according to your choice. And that's a rather accurate translation of that or interpretation of that, then it changes some of the things that we have with difficulty with David. How can David be a man after God's own heart and perform all the not-hated things that he does, which, by the way, we do? How can we say here that we are men after God's own heart today when we can look ourselves in the mirror and we can see what we have done and know what we have done to hurt ourselves, to hurt our wives, to hurt our children, and to hurt our brethren, and to hurt our God? How can we do that? Because we are men of God's choosing. We're not men of our choice. God chose us. Okay, time out. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying, okay, he chose you, he rejected you, chose you, rejected you. The choosing that God had is, when you choose me, I choose you. How could David face that giant? How could David run from Saul like that? Because he knew what God could do with him. He'd already seen it when keeping the sheep. Listen, when you're Caleb and Cason's age, you're out watching the sheep and you kill a bear in a lion with your bare hands, what's a 9-foot giant to you? What's a 7-foot king to you? Right? You already see what God can do to you. God can do with you. Here is David, a man that God has chosen. I know Eugene Peterson, his word, the message is kind of suspect at times, and it's a good consult, not a good translation necessarily, because it's just by one single man, but I love how Peterson says this. God said, okay, you blew it, I got it. Here's the man I'm going to choose right now. Sit back and let me make the choosing. He chooses David. But is David the man that God's choosing? Is he really the man after God's own heart? God said, I'm going to give you a king. You can't wait. You're chomping at the bit. You'll be like everybody else. I was going to give you a king all along. David's God's choice, but is David really God's choice? Or is God's choice the man that Tim will talk about? That is the descendant of David, who has the heart of God, who says, I do all things always that please the Father. So is David really the focal point? Or is God looking past David to the king he really wants to give? Now that's the ultimate. But back to David just a moment. So let's assume that's incorrect. Let's assume it really is the emphasis on David, because 1 Kings chapter 5, 3 through 5, tells us there was not anybody else did right more than David did. Again, we kind of look at that, we go, do what? How's that? So how does David, if it's David, not what I just said, if the emphasis is on David himself, not on God's choice, then how do we reconcile all this with David and the sins that he's committed and the mistakes that he makes and the disaster of his family? Because he also, like Eli and Samuel, do not restrain his children. Amnon rapes Tamar. Absalom comes in and says, okay, you did nothing about it. You sit back here with your hands in your pocket, twiddling your thumbs. I got it. I'll take care of her. Send him over to me under the shroud of coming to help, and I will kill him. Back up just a moment. It's interesting that David puts Uriah out to be killed because that is exactly what Saul did to David. Saul sent David out in battle to be killed, but it didn't happen. And so David learns from Saul, if you want a guy killed, set him in front of the battle, pull the battle back, and sure enough, he'll be killed. That's how Uriah got killed. And Saul tried to do the same thing with David. Now that you have the same thing, guess what? Absalom's doing the same thing. Pull everybody back. I got Amnon. Oh, I'm sorry, he killed in battle. These guys just killing one another. They're lusting after the women, killing with one another, lying to each other, counting the census of people, taking showbread, everything that you would think you ought not to do. And so how does that jive with David then being a man after God's own heart? Well, here's my thought. When you turn to Psalm 51, you see the real man David. In Psalm 32, David's sin is eating him up. You ever been there, guys? You know the sin. Maybe it's affected your family. Maybe it wasn't adultery like this or fornication like this, but you know the sin is affecting your family. It's eating the heart and soul out of you. And you know it. You just turn your face against it. You know it. You know good and well. You know what, and you know why. You know why you're having to take Pepsi all the time now. You know why your stomach's upset. You know why you got heartburn. It's not the Mexican food you ate. It's the sin that's eating the heart and soul out of you. He said, my bones were melting like wax. And Nathan comes to him. By the way, Nathan is David's best advisor too, because his last moments in just a minute. I do have a point to all this, I promise. And he tells him a nice story. Another lesson for us. When we have to confront people, telling nice stories generally go over their head. And in the end, they'll say, that was a really nice story. Whoever did that ought to die. Yeah, mirror, you're the man. Sometimes you just have to say, okay, this is the sin, you're the man. And Nathan finally had to get to it. And when it was, David was broken. And you have Psalm 51, and you walk through that whole psalm. We don't have time to do it. You walk through the whole Psalm 51. You see, he understands what God wants. God doesn't want more blood in the streets. He can provide lambs. He wants a contrite heart. He pleads for it, restore the joy of my soul. Have mercy on me. You ever been that broken? You ever been that broken where you get on your knees and the joy of salvation, the Lord's Spirit has departed from you? And you know it? And you're on your knees, broken, sobbing, and saying, Lord, please restore the joy of your salvation. Please restore your spirit. Have mercy on me. David's owning it now. He's a little late to the party, but he's owning it. He's standing up to his responsibility before God. And Psalm 51 is the quintessential moment of the man that God chose to be king. Because he did not turn away from that at that moment. He stood and had to face it. And he had to face it before the God he sinned against. And said, please, oh God, have mercy on me. That's humbling. And that's a legacy. And that's true wealth as well. Well, you'd think it'd get easier for David, wouldn't you? but he's on his deathbed. Adonijah hears it. It's interesting when you go back and you read about Absalom, what Absalom did. Got 50 men out in front of him. Here goes Adonijah, 50 men out in front of him. He's got this whole entourage. And he's going to be king now. And Nathan hears about it. He goes, Bathsheba, and said, by the way, do you know that Adonijah over here is planning to be king? And did not David somewhere along the way tell you that Solomon's going to be the king? Yeah. So Bathsheba goes into David. Now David's got about 8 wives. But Bathsheba seems to be that special one. And said, do you remember promising me that Solomon could be king? He said, yeah, that's what I planned. He said, well, did you know Adonijah's got a big celebration going on here? He's going to coronate himself? And David said, okay, Nathan, this is what you do. Go get these folks, bring them in, and you put Solomon on my mule. And you now let everybody know he's going to be king, and Adonijah hears about it. And Adonijah starts saying, please don't kill me. He said, okay, if you become a good boy and you don't fight against me, then you'll live. Well, that's not exactly how it's said, but that's the sense of it. If you play fair here, I won't take your life. And so even in David's death, he's challenged. So what do we take away from this in the life of David in the last few minutes that we have as far as it relates to being a man? I just have a couple of bullet points here. First of all, you never have to doubt David's deep reverence for God. Even in David's weakest moments, you never have to doubt David's reverence for God. His reverence for God, his faith in God. It is said of Saul, because you obeyed me not. It is said of David, because you followed and obeyed me. There's your difference. David followed and obeyed God where Saul did not follow and obey God. You never have to doubt David's reverence. He makes some mistakes, but you never have to doubt his reverence and faith in God. He forgot the senses. He lost his mind. Others suffered as a result. But David's reverence for God is never in question. As men, we may have a lot of weaknesses. And we do. But that does not mitigate our deep reverence for God. That's the heart and soul of what makes us who we are. The second is, while David tried to take some matters in his own hands on occasion, he recognized that God's in control. What was important to God was important to David. What was important to God was not important to Saul. He knew God could be trusted because what burdened God burdened David. What burdened God did not burden Saul. Saul's burden was what was Saul's burden. Saul's burden was what burdened Saul. What burdened David, what burdened God burdened David. He realized God was in control ultimately all along the way. Okay, he lost his way for a little bit. He lost his way for a little bit. Maybe you've never done that. Maybe you never had that moment where you lost your way. Maybe you never had that dark moment. Not some overt sin like adultery like this, but maybe you've never had that dark moment where in that dark moment you said, I'm through, I'm done, I'm walking away. I'm done. Did that mean then overall you lost your reverence and faith in God and that you came to the conclusion God's not in control? No. We just lost our way. But David had Nathan that always kept bringing him back. And sometimes we have elders that help bring us back. Sometimes we have friends that help bring us back. The next thing is, David, there were no locked doors. There was openness. And this to me is one of the real hallmarks, David, when he was wrong, he admitted it. He did not cover it. And I think that's the key to David's heart with God. I think it's seen when Nathan approaches David. Nathan tells him, you're the man. He's a broken man. He's not broken because Nathan tells him that. He's already a broken man. He just hadn't come to that contrite heart yet. He says, have mercy on me. He asks to be cleansed. He acknowledges his transgression. He appeals for purging and to be washed. He's been living with guilt and sadness and shame. He cries, make me hear the joy and gladness again. He knows his spirit is used, abused, trampled on, and wants a clean heart. He knows Uriah is dead because of his hand. David has slain Uriah, but David gets the point with God. If God wanted more sacrifice, he'd give it to him. But what he wanted was David's heart. And David said, here's my heart. I repent. I repent. I come to you in repentance and beg your forgiveness. I'm going to tell you that's a long road to travel sometimes. And it's not always automatic. Sometimes you have to really get down to where you're in the weeds and the muck and the mire. And what you realize is hell's open door is in your face. And then you come to the point that says, I can't do this, I want to be lost. And you appeal to all you've wronged. Please forgive me. David is God's man because his heart was completely his. The 78th Psalm says, he chose David his servant, he took him from the sheepfolds. Psalm 89 says, I found David my servant, my holy oil I anoint with him. God's saying, I'm not interested in another slick promotion project. That's Saul. I'm not interested in the slick packaging here. I'm not interested in someone that looks like a king. I want someone that will be my king. I want someone with a servant's heart. Real men serve others. They don't live to be served. And sometimes there's not a lot of glory in that. You know, sometimes I'm afraid that when we talk about elders, shepherds, bishops, that we think, once you've been asked to do that, you have reached the pinnacle among brethren. You're at the top of the mountain here. Hallelujah for you. Now everybody can stand and cheer you on. I'll be glad to give my shoes to you. Because that's not what it is. You're not at the top of the food chain, you're at the bottom of the food chain. Because you're there to serve others. And sometimes you're there to serve others in some of their muckiest, manure-tainted problems that you'd never imagine. And sometimes you get the manure of the sheep on you. And you have to go home and take a bath and lie soap to wash it off so it doesn't stick. David realized as king, he was here to serve. And that's what Jesus told us. Another thing is, we're all the recipients of grace and deep friendship. We're all the recipients of grace and deep friendship. David had Jonathan. Man, that's significant. And we lost Jonathan. If Jonathan had still been alive in 2 Samuel 11, I just wonder, would David have done that? How much can one person make a difference in our lives? That one person makes a difference in our lives. The one person that loves us enough, courageous enough, cares enough, that comes and says, I got to talk to you. I see a problem you're having here. I'm concerned about you. I see the direction you're going. Listen, we got to turn this around. The plane's going down. Somebody's got to put up on the stick here. Well, we got to change this. I do this because I love you, not because I want to hurt you. I get no joy in this. He had Jonathan, and he had his advisor Nathan along the way. We all need those mentors. Man, I tell you. I'm thankful for my dad. I'm thankful for Joe Fitch. I'm thankful for Dan Shipley. I'm thankful for Dee Bowman. In preaching, those are my mentors. I'm thankful for Bill Burke. I'm thankful for Dale Davis. I'm thankful for Joe Fagan. Among elders, those are my mentors. By the way, I buried Bill Burke because he drowned November 1st, 1986. I helped bury Darrell because of his Alzheimer's. I still have Joe. But you know what? My mentor's hurting right now. Because over 2 weeks ago, his wife had a stroke. And she's still in rehab. And it's changed their lives. And now it's the time for the 5 of us to hold the man up who's been holding us up. You see how that comes around? Sometimes, as with the showbread, all you can do is say, God, please forgive me, plead for mercy. You know, we struggle with situation ethics. In Matthew chapter 12, God uses the showbread because the disciples are being hammered because they're eating the grain and all that stuff. He said, well, you excused David with the showbread. Was that right? No. God's not saying David gets excused. Sometimes all you can do is say, I blew it. Plead for mercy. I made the best choice I could. In the circumstances, I made the best choice I could. Maybe it's the wrong choice. I see now I could have done different. All we can do is plead for mercy. That's not a pass. All I can do is say, I'm sorry, I plead for mercy. And sometimes in a relationship, that's all you can do. Sometimes all I can say to my wife is, look, it was boneheaded, it was stupid, I was dumb, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Sometimes all I can say to my fellow elders is the same thing. Sometimes all I can say to my brother is, look, I'm sorry. I blew it. Please forgive me. I did the best I could. I'm sorry. And another thing is servants serve for the good of their masters. They don't care who gets the credit. When like Saul, we have to stand up and say, listen, give me the credit. That's not a man. That's not being a man. Manhood is helping others get the credit. I love what Paul says in Romans 12. In honor, giving preference to one another. It's my responsibility as a man to make sure others are put forth first. That's part of humility. And then not only will we fail, but when we fail, we'll be hurt by others and disappointed by them. Saul, Michael, Amnon, Absalom, Adonijah, Ahithophel. And then finally, as I bring it to a close, the day of our death will be no different than the days of our lives. The day of our death will be no different than the day of our lives. David didn't restrain or confront. And the day of his death, he didn't. The day of our weakness, we're vulnerable and need someone trusted. In the end, no one is dependent. We're all dependent on someone else. It's important we keep our promises along the way. And so, we all have our moments. We have our moments of success when we slay our giants. We also have our moments of struggle, disappointment, and even failure. It's then that our true heart is seen. I close with the words of Jesus, and I think this is David. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. Saul said, you shall love Saul with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and all your strength. The question is, which do we want to be? So whether it's because God chose him, or whether it's a reference to David, I'm not sure it's either or. I think it's both and. God chose him, and David becomes the man God calls him to be.